The airport lounge buzzed with reunions, but Brenda wasn't there. Calvin scanned the faces, his smile fading as minutes bled into an hour. His sea bag, heavy on the floor, felt like a public declaration of abandonment. He pulled out his phone, a cold dread replacing his homecoming warmth. "Your number," the message from an unknown contact read, "has been blocked." Calvin Miller sat hunched in the window seat, the jet's engine drone a familiar, dull thrum against the backdrop of his 30 years. Below, the patchwork of Idaho farmland blurred into mountains, signaling the end of his journey. 30 years as a Marine gunnery sergeant, etched into the lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw. Now it was done. He was a civilian again, headed home for good. He pulled the worn Zippo from his pocket, the silver cool against his thumb. Brenda had given it to him before his first deployment, a quarter-century ago. He ran his calloused finger over the engraved initials, CM plus BM, a small monument to a long marriage, endured mostly through letters and hurried phone calls across continents. He pictured her, Brenda, standing on the porch of their old two-story house, a faint smile on her face. He envisioned their kids, Darlene and Seth, grown now, but still his. He'd missed so much, but he'd made it back. Now he would settle down, plant roots, and spend his days fixing whatever broke around the house, watching the seasons turn. The thought of it was a quiet hum in his chest, a stark contrast to the roar of combat he'd known for half his life. He felt a readiness for the ordinary, a deep, bone-weary craving for it. The plane landed with a jolt in Spokane, the wheels squealing against the asphalt. He moved through the terminal, the weight of his sea bag familiar on his shoulder. He expected Brenda to be waiting by the baggage claim, perhaps a hand-drawn sign, a small joke like she always did. But the crowd was a blur of strangers and excited reunions. He scanned the faces, then scanned them again. No Brenda. His smile, already a little strained from the long flight, slowly receded. He checked his watch. The flight was on time. He pulled out his phone, his thumb moving quickly. "Landed. Where you at, Bren?" he texted. He waited, staring at the screen, then scrolled through his contacts, calling her direct line. It rang 3 times, then went straight to voicemail. A strange twist began in his gut, a cold knot he hadn't felt in years. He called again. Same result. He tried texting one more time. No reply. He took a deep breath, the stale airport air doing little to calm him. He called her parents' number. His mother-in-law, Carol, answered on the second ring, her voice thin and reedy. "Calvin, you made it back?" she asked, a surprise in her voice. "Just landed, Carol. I can't get a hold of Brenda. Is she with you?" A beat of silence. "No, Calvin. She didn't say she was coming over. Haven't heard from her since Tuesday." The knot tightened. "All right. Thanks, Carol." He hung up, the phone feeling heavy in his hand. He stood near the curbside pickup, the afternoon sun glaring off the parked cars. A tall, well-built man in clean khakis and a collared shirt approached him. His hair was neatly combed, a smile on his face. "Rough day, huh, Marine?" the man said, nodding at Calvin's sea bag. "Waiting on a ride?" Calvin grunted, looking him over. "Yeah, I am." "Walt Henderson," the man offered, extending a hand. "I'm headed north past Coeur d'Alene. If you're going that way, I can give you a lift. White Ford Explorer just around the corner." Calvin hesitated, then nodded. "Calvin Miller, appreciate it." He tossed his gear into the back of Walt's gleaming white SUV, a flicker of relief pushing back against the lingering unease. It wasn't Brenda, but it was a way home. The drive was mostly quiet. Walt made small talk, asking about Calvin's service, talking about the local fishing. "I run a camp up near Priest Lake," Walt explained, his eyes on the road. "For men, get 'em out in nature, clear their heads." Calvin just nodded, his gaze fixed on the familiar landscape unfolding outside the window. Fields, then pines, then glimpses of water. Each mile closer amplified the strange silence from Brenda. They pulled into the long gravel driveway, the house appearing from behind the tall pines. It sat quiet, still. No car in the driveway, no lights on, even with dusk approaching. Just the silent, empty house. "Where are you, Bren?" Calvin whispered, the words catching in his throat. Walt killed the engine. As Calvin reached for his bag, Walt glanced at the house, then back at Calvin. "Well, nada," he said, a peculiar lilt in his voice. Guess you'll have your wife around now, won't you? After all this time, the comment hung in the air, landing flat, almost too casual. Calvin just nodded, pulling his sea bag out. He thanked Walt, who just waved a hand and drove off. The sound of the SUV receding left a deeper silence. He walked up the porch steps, the wood creaking under his weight. The key turned in the lock with a rusty click. The house was cold, smelling faintly of dust and something else, something he couldn't quite place. He dropped his sea bag by the door, the thud echoing in the quiet. The living room looked mostly the same, but a picture frame on the mantelpiece was slightly askew, and a lamp he knew Brenda always kept lit was dark. Minor things, but they scratched at the edges of his memory, tiny discrepancies. He tried Brenda's cell again, the phone pressing cold against his ear. It went straight to voicemail. He just stood there, the weight of his sea bag still on his shoulders, an unfamiliar dread settling heavy in his chest. Calvin stood in the silent living room, the quiet pressing in on him, making the house feel larger, colder. Dusk settled outside, bleeding purple and gray across the windows. He waited, listening, but the only sound was the distant hum of the refrigerator. He walked to the front door, stepping out onto the porch, the air crisp and cool. The mailbox stood at the end of the driveway, a small red flag still down. He walked out, pulled it open. Inside, a stack of circulars, a utility bill, nothing personal. He walked back, the gravel crunching under his boots, the silence of the evening deepening. He decided a bath might help, a long soak to wash off the airplane grime and the growing unease. He pushed open the bedroom door, the light inside muted, then headed for the ensuite bathroom. He tried the handle. Locked. He tried again. A harder turn. Still locked. He frowned. Brenda never locked the bathroom door. "Brenda?" he called out, his voice sounding rough in the stillness. No answer. He rattled the handle again, then sighed, a slow, drawn-out sound. Just then his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Brenda. He snatched it out, a wave of relief washing over him, followed quickly by a fresh surge of irritation. "Bren, where are you? What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. Her voice was distant, strained, almost fragile. "Calvin, oh, Calvin, I'm so sorry. There was an emergency. I couldn't get away." "Emergency? What kind of emergency?" His relief evaporated, replaced by a sharp suspicion. Her words sounded rehearsed, like lines from a bad play. "Just a family thing. Up in Sandpoint. My aunt took ill, suddenly. I had to go." Calvin narrowed his eyes, though she couldn't see him. "Your Aunt Susan? She's been gone 10 years, Bren." A beat of silence, a sharp intake of breath on her end. "No, not Susan. My Aunt Beatrice. From my mother's side. You barely know her." "Right, May," he said, the word heavy with doubt. "Everything all right, Bren? You sound off." "I'm fine, Calvin. Just tired. It's been a long day. A lot happened." "Well, come home then," he said, his voice softer. A plea rather than a demand. "I just got back. I want to see you." "I will, Calvin, as soon as I can. I just need to wrap things up here." "What things?" "Us things. I'll call you later. I promise." Her voice was already fading. The conversation rushed. "I love you. Bye." The line went dead. He stared at the phone, then slowly lowered it. "As soon as I can." Vague. Always vague. He walked back into the bedroom, a strange scent hitting him. Not her usual lavender, something sharper, muskier, masculine. He walked to the nightstand beside the bed, his eyes scanning. And there it was, a man's watch. Steel band, heavy face, not his watch. His stomach clenched into a hard knot. He reached for it, his fingers brushing the cool metal. It was too big for Brenda, too heavy, and it definitely wasn't his. He picked it up, turned it over in his hand. No engraving, just a simple, expensive-looking watch. He opened the top drawer of the nightstand. His breath hitched. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of Brenda's handkerchiefs, were delicate, lacy undergarments. Not Brenda's size. Smaller, much smaller. He pushed the drawer shut, a cold shiver running down his spine. His eyes moved, scanning the room, looking for anything else, any other sign. Near the edge of the nightstand, almost hidden by a stack of magazines, he saw a small, folded piece of paper. He picked it up, his hands trembling slightly. He unfolded it, a name, scrawled in a masculine hand, Walt. Below it, a phone number, not his phone number, the man from the airport, Walt Henderson. A cold dread spread through him, a slow, viscous chill, the locked bathroom door, Brenda's vague answers, the strange scent, the watch, the lingerie. Walt's odd comment, "Guess you'll have your wife around now, won't you?" It all clicked into place, a terrible, undeniable puzzle. He walked to the bathroom, rattled the locked door again, then pushed. Nothing. He went to the hall bathroom instead, turning on the shower, letting the water run cold. He stripped off his clothes, stepping under the icy spray, hoping it would wash away the feeling, the knowledge. But it clung to him, a foul-smelling film. He closed his eyes, recalling Brenda's strained voice, the hurried goodbye, the lie about her aunt. He saw the watch glinting on the nightstand, the tiny intimate clothes, the name Walt. The realization was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left him gasping under the relentless cold water. He stood there for a long time, letting the water numb him, then dried off, his skin raw and stinging. He walked back to the bedroom, the room now feeling alien, hostile. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress still bearing the imprint of another body, not his. He pulled out his Zippo, the "To My Beloved Husband" engraving mocking him in the dim light. It felt impossibly heavy in his hand, a tangible lie. He knew deep down that something was terribly wrong. Far beyond a missed pickup, beyond a simple emergency. This was something else entirely. This was a betrayal. The porch light flickered on around 9, casting long shadows across the gravel. Calvin stood by the living room window, watching Brenda's beat-up sedan pull into the driveway. She parked, killed the engine, and sat there for a moment. He saw her take a deep breath before opening the door. She walked to the house, her steps slow, almost hesitant. The key turned in the lock. "Calvin, you home?" Her voice was thin, an attempt at cheerfulness. She walked into the living room, her eyes darting around, avoiding his. She tried a small, tentative smile. "Sorry I'm so late. That whole Sandpoint thing, it just got away from me." Calvin didn't move from the window, his back to her. "Sandpoint, huh? Your Aunt Beatrice is doing all right?" His voice was calm, steady, but with an edge that he knew she'd recognize. Her shoulders tensed. "Yes, she's fine. It was a scare, but she'll pull through." She still hadn't looked at him directly. She fidgeted with the strap of her purse. "It's good to see you, Cal. You look tired." He turned slowly, facing her. His gaze was unwavering, cold. "Where were you, Brenda?" Her face paled. "I told you, Sandpoint." She tried to sound firm, but her voice wavered. "No, you didn't. You lied to me, Brenda." He took a step closer, then another. "And who's Walt?" She flinched, her eyes widening. "Walt? What are you talking about?" Calvin reached into his pocket, pulling out the steel watch, letting it dangle from his fingers. He held up the small, folded note with the name and number. "Whose is this, Brenda?" His voice remained even, but his jaw was tight. Her bravado crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes, then spilled over, tracing paths down her cheeks. She choked back a sob. "Oh, Cal, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen." The confession hung in the air, a thick, suffocating thing. His mind replayed the name on the note, Walt. A sickening familiarity twisted in his gut. Walt Henderson, the man who had driven him home. The man with the white SUV, the man who ran a camp for men near Priest Lake. The man who had said, "Guess you'll have your wife around now, won't you?" "Walt Henderson," Calvin said, the name a bitter taste in his mouth. "The man who gave me a ride from the airport." Brenda nodded, unable to speak, her face buried in her hands. The irony of it, the cold, cruel joke, twisted inside him. He had accepted a ride from the man who was defiling his home, his marriage. "How long?" he asked, his voice low, each word a fresh stab. She sniffled, pulling her hands away, her eyes red and swollen. "Months, Cal. It started a few months after you left for your last deployment. I was lonely. He was just there." "There," Calvin repeated, the word flat. "How there was he, Brenda? Was he there in my bed, in my house?" He gestured around the living room. Was he there when you told me you missed me? She nodded again, her head bowed, unable to meet his gaze. He'd come over. Sometimes we'd just talk. Then it just snowballed, Calvin finished for her, a deep weariness settling over him. While I was gone, fighting in some god-forsaken desert, he was here, in my home. He remembered something else. Did he drop Darlene and Seth off at school? Brenda hesitated, then nodded again, a whimper escaping her lips. Sometimes. When I had errands, he was just trying to help, Cal. A surge of rage, hot and sharp, flared within him. His sanctuary, his home, the place he'd dreamed of returning to for 3 decades, had been contaminated, violated. The rage, however, was quickly tempered by a bone-deep exhaustion, a profound disappointment that eclipsed all else. His dreams of retirement, of quiet days with Brenda, of a peaceful life, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The kids, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Do they know? Brenda shook her head frantically. No, no, Cal. They don't know anything, I swear. He was careful. We both were. Calvin looked at her, his wife of 30 years, now a stranger. The woman he'd carried pictures of. The woman whose face he'd seen in his mind through firefights and sleepless nights. Now she was just a source of pain. He felt numb, the raw edges of betrayal dulling into a cold ache. The Zippo in his pocket, to my beloved husband, felt like a bad joke. Get out, he said, the words cutting through the air. Pack a bag, Brenda. You need to go. She looked up, startled, tears streaming down her face again. Go? Where would I go, Cal? I don't care, he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. You can go to Walt, or your Aunt Beatrice in Sandpoint. Just not here. Not in my house. He pointed to the bedroom. And take his watch with you. Brenda packed quickly, her movements stiff and jerky. She grabbed a small duffel bag, stuffing a few clothes into it, her sobs muffled. She didn't look at Calvin as she walked past him, her eyes fixed on the door. He watched her go, the sound of her car pulling away echoing in the night. Then silence. A deafening silence that settled over the house, heavier than any noise. It was the sound of something ending, completely. He stood in the middle of the living room, the space suddenly vast and empty. His phone felt cold in his hand. He scrolled through his contacts, settling on a familiar name. Lieutenant Colonel Jim. Jim had been his commanding officer for years, a mentor, a friend. He answered on the second ring, his voice gruff, tired. Calvin, you made it home, Gunny? Everything all right? Calvin took a breath, trying to form the words. How do you explain 30 years, a wife, a life, dissolving in a single night? No, Jim, not exactly. He paused, struggling. It's Brenda. She had an affair with a guy here. Jim was silent for a moment. Jesus, Cal, I'm sorry to hear that. You need anything? I don't know, Jim. I don't know. He couldn't elaborate, couldn't give voice to the sordid details. The words felt too big, too humiliating. All right, Gunny, just take it slow. You need anything, anything at all, you call me. Day or night. Thanks, Jim. He hung up, the conversation offering little solace. His eyes fell on the Zippo, still lying on the floor where he'd dropped it. To my beloved husband. The inscription, once a cherished symbol, now felt like a cruel, mocking joke. He picked it up, feeling the cool metal. For a moment, he considered keeping it as a grim reminder. Then, with a sudden surge of disgust, he hurled it across the room. It clattered against the wall, then fell silently to the carpet. He didn't bother to pick it up. His mind raced, replaying the events of the day. Walt Henderson, his easy smile, his firm handshake, the casual offer of a ride, the sheer, unadulterated audacity of it all. The man had driven him, the cuckolded husband, home to a house he had, in essence, already occupied. The memory ignited a cold, hard fury within him. He wasn't going to let this stand. Not with violence, not with a public scene, but with the full, unyielding weight of his anger and disillusionment. He found the note again. The paper crumpled, but the name and number clear. He punched the numbers into his phone, then quickly found an online reverse directory. The address came up quickly. Walt Henderson, a few miles north, near the lake. The camp he had mentioned. Calvin got his keys, the silent house feeling like a tomb. The drive was a blur of rural Idaho landscape, the dark trees rushing past, the stars bright in the cold night sky. His mind was a whirlwind of hurt and fury, each thought a fresh wound. He pictured Brenda's tear-streaked face, Walt's casual confidence, the betrayal, the deceit. It all coalesced into a single burning purpose. He found the turnoff, a small sign marking Henderson's camp. A dirt road led past a few cabins, then opened to a clearing. There, parked near a larger, rustic lodge, was Walt's familiar white SUV. He killed his headlights, pulling up quietly behind it. He got out, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. He saw Walt coming out of the lodge, carrying a toolbox. He stopped short, his eyes widening in surprise as he recognized Calvin in the dim light. "Calvin, what's going on? What are you doing here?" Walt asked, trying to sound calm, but a flicker of fear danced in his eyes. Calvin didn't mince words. His voice was low, steady, devoid of any warmth. "Brenda told me everything. The watch, the note, your name." He took a step closer. "You rode me home, you snake. You drove me to my own damn house, knowing you'd been there, in my bed, knowing you were with my wife." Walt swallowed hard, his face losing its color. "Look, Calvin, it's not what you think. It's complicated. Brenda was lonely. You were gone for so long." He tried to gesture, to offer some pathetic excuse. Calvin cut him off, his voice rising slightly, but still controlled. "Lonely? I was serving my country, you bastard. 30 years. I spent 30 years away from my family. For them, for this life. And you came in here, and you picked it apart, piece by piece." He leaned closer, his voice a harsh whisper. "My kids, Walt, Darlene and Seth. You dropped them off at school. You were playing house with my family." Walt tried to speak, but Calvin held up a hand, a gesture he'd used countless times to silence insubordinate Marines. "You stay away from my family, Walt. You hear me? Away from Brenda, away from my kids. If I ever see you near them, I swear to God." He didn't finish the threat. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. Calvin stared at him for a long moment, letting the silence press down. He didn't want a public scene, not yet. He just wanted Walt to understand. "This ain't over, Walt," he said, his voice flat, chilling. "Not by a long shot." He turned, walked back to his car, and got in. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Walt was still standing there, frozen, the toolbox still in his hand, his face a mixture of fear and defiance, burned into Calvin's mind. Calvin returned to the silent house, the drive back from Walt's camp a blur of cold rage and disbelief. The porch light was still on, casting a pale glow on the empty driveway. The house, which had been his dream, his anchor, now felt like a battleground where his trust lay shattered. He walked through the rooms, each familiar object suddenly alien, tainted. Walt had been here. He'd sat on this couch. He'd eaten at this table. He'd even dropped his kids off at school. The sheer casual ease with which Walt had infiltrated his life, his family, festered inside him. He knew what he had to do next, a task more daunting than any combat mission. He had to tell Darlene and Seth. He picked up his phone, his hand trembling slightly. He called Darlene first, her number etched into his memory. She answered, her voice bright, full of college student energy. "Dad, everything okay? You just got home, right?" "Yeah, Darlene, I'm home." He tried to keep his voice steady, normal. "Look, I need you to come home for a bit. We need to talk. Something important." A pause. "Is Mom okay? Is everything all right?" Her voice was laced with immediate concern. "Just come home, honey, soon as you can." He knew she'd sense the underlying tension, the unusual urgency in his tone. Next, he called Seth's elementary school. Mrs. Davison, Seth's third-grade teacher, answered. "Mrs. Davison, this is Calvin Miller, Seth's father. I need to pick Seth up early today." "Oh, Mr. Miller, welcome home. Is everything all right? Seth hasn't been feeling well?" "No, he's fine, just a family matter. I need him home." He arranged the pickup, his mind already racing ahead to the conversation he dreaded. Darlene arrived an hour later, her brow furrowed with worry. She walked into the living room, her eyes immediately scanning the empty space. Where's Mom, Dad? What's going on? Her voice was tight with apprehension. He saw the same question reflected in her eyes that she hadn't voiced during their phone call. Calvin sat her down on the couch, the same couch where he'd discovered the betrayal just hours before. The thought of their pain, his children's pain, weighed heavily on him, a crushing burden. He waited for Seth, who arrived a few minutes later, clutching his backpack, his small face still flushed from the brisk walk from school. Calvin sat them both down, one on each side of him. "Kids," he started, his voice rough. "Your mom and I, we're going to be separating." He watched Seth's face crumple immediately. "Separating? What does that mean? Is Mom coming back?" Seth burst into tears, his small body shaking. Darlene, older and more perceptive, looked at him, her eyes sharp. "Separating? Why? Dad, what happened? Is she seeing someone else?" The directness of her question hit him hard. He swallowed, the words tasting like ash. "Yes, Darlene, she is." He took a deep breath. His name is Walt Henderson." Darlene's eyes widened. "Walt? Walt Henderson? The man who sometimes picks Seth up from school?" The realization stung her, a look of betrayal mirrored in her own young face. "He seemed nice enough," she whispered, her voice laced with confusion. Seth just cried, burying his face in Calvin's side, too young to fully grasp the complexities, but understanding enough that something vital had broken. He kept asking for his mother, his pleas small, heartbroken sounds. Calvin held them both, his arms wrapped tightly around his children, his anchors in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. "Look at me," he said, gently lifting Darlene's chin, then turning Seth's face towards him. "You two, you are my world. Nothing, absolutely nothing will ever change that. I love you more than anything. We're going to get through this, together." His voice was firm, a promise, a rock in the shifting sands. He stared at their tear-streaked faces, knowing this was just the beginning of their grief, and his own. After he had settled them, helped Seth with his homework, and tried to distract them with a quiet dinner, he put them to bed. The house grew silent again, but the silence now was different, heavier with their unspoken questions and his own profound sadness. He walked into his study, the room still filled with the faint scent of old paper and leather. He started to organize his life, pulling out folders of legal documents, the house deed, his military discharge papers, bank statements. The weight of starting over after 30 years felt crushing. The quiet farmhouse, once a symbol of his enduring love and future, now felt like a tomb. It had been his haven, his planned retirement. Now it was just a house, full of ghosts and the echoes of a broken promise. It's in these quiet moments, when the world strips away all the facades, that you see the true cost of choices, the ones made and the ones unmade. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. Calvin sat across from Agnes, a local attorney whose office smelled of old paper and strong coffee. She was a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. He laid out the facts, flat and unadorned, the story of his homecoming, the watch, the note, the confession. Agnes listened, occasionally nodding, making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Given the circumstances, Gunnery Sergeant Miller," she said, her voice crisp, "will pursue full custody of Seth. Brenda's instability, coupled with the affair, should weigh heavily in your favor. As for assets, the house, your pension, these are significant." She outlined the complications, the financial and emotional landscape of divorce, each word a fresh cut. Brenda, through her own lawyer, contested nearly everything. She wanted the house, citing her long-term residence. She argued for shared custody, claiming Calvin's military background meant he was often away, unfit for primary care. Each legal document, each exchange between lawyers, was a reminder of the broken trust, a bitter struggle fought over the remnants of a life. The affair, once a private shame, was now a matter of public record, debated in court filings. Calvin fought for Seth with a quiet ferocity. His son needed stability, a constant presence. Brenda, he argued, had shown a clear lapse in judgment, prioritizing her own needs over the well-being of their family. Darlene, already an adult, observed the proceedings with a quiet, heavy heart. She struggled to reconcile the mother she knew with the woman capable of such a betrayal, the woman whose choices had fractured their family beyond repair. The day Walt Henderson was subpoenaed, Calvin sat rigid in the courtroom. Walt, dressed in a suit that looked uncomfortable on his frame, tried to maintain an air of composure, but his eyes darted nervously. His testimony, though reluctant, laid bare the details of the affair, the frequency of his visits, the extent of his presence in their home while Calvin was away. Each sordid detail was another brick in the wall of Calvin's humiliation, his private pain laid bare for strangers to dissect. He looked at the judge, the bailiff, the opposing counsel, and felt a profound weariness. 30 years of loyalty to his country, to his comrades, reduced to this. He thought of the men he'd served with, the unwavering trust they shared in the face of death. This domestic battlefield felt crueler, more treacherous. Finally, after months of filings and court appearances, the judge delivered the verdict. Calvin was granted primary custody of Seth. The family home, the two-story house he'd returned to with so much hope, was awarded to him. Brenda was given limited visitation rights, supervised initially, and ordered to pay child support, a sum she struggled to meet, often sending partial payments or none at all. Calvin felt no triumph, no exhilaration. It was a hollow victory, the legal resolution doing little to heal the deep emotional wounds. The ink on the divorce papers was dry, but the scars remained fresh. He tried to shield Seth from the ugliness, from the financial struggles Brenda faced, from the obvious pain that still lingered between his parents. But Seth, though young, absorbed it all. The boy's quiet sadness was undeniable, a shadow that followed him even during playtime. Darlene, meanwhile, retreated further from Brenda. Calls became less frequent, visits almost non-existent. She couldn't understand, couldn't forgive, the choices her mother had made. She moved back home temporarily after college, offering Calvin quiet support, her presence a steadying force in the turbulent house. The family home, now legally his, was still filled with echoes. Echoes of Brenda's laughter, of shared meals, of a life that was, and echoes of a life that could have been. A peaceful retirement, a family reunited. Instead, it was just him, Seth, and Darlene navigating a new fractured reality. The silence in the evenings no longer peaceful, but a stark reminder of what had been lost. Each creak of the floorboards, each gust of wind against the windows, seemed to carry the weight of shattered dreams. Calvin fell into a new routine, a single father in what was supposed to be his quiet retirement. His days, once structured by military discipline, were now governed by school schedules, homework, and bedtime stories. He'd envisioned days of fishing and puttering in the garage, not navigating the emotional minefield of a child's fractured world. His retirement plans, once a clear path, were now a tangled mess of responsibilities and unforeseen challenges. He dedicated himself to Seth, trying to be both father and mother, to fill the gaping hole Brenda had left. He saw the changes in his son, the subtle shifts in his demeanor. Seth's grades, once steady, began to slip. He became quieter, more withdrawn, his laughter less frequent. The divorce had left a trauma, a sadness that Calvin saw in the boy's eyes, even when he tried to smile. To reconnect, to build new memories, Calvin took Seth out into the familiar Idaho woods. They went fishing on the lake, the cool morning air crisp against their faces. He taught Seth how to bait a hook, how to cast, how to wait with patience for a bite. Later, they went hunting, Calvin teaching Seth about tracking, about the respectful solitude of the wilderness. These moments, quiet and shared, were slow steps towards rebuilding, small victories in the larger battle for normalcy. Brenda's attempts at visitation were inconsistent, often sporadic. She'd call, promise a weekend, then cancel last minute, citing vague reasons. Each missed visit was another disappointment for Seth, another crack in the fragile trust. Calvin would see the light dim in his son's eyes, the small slump of his shoulders, and feel a fresh surge of protective anger. Through whispers and local gossip, Calvin heard that Brenda's relationship with Walt was faltering. The public nature of the affair, the messy divorce, the financial strains, it had taken its toll. He heard they argued often, that Walt's camp was struggling. Calvin felt no satisfaction in this news, no sense of triumph, only a quiet, grim understanding of the inevitable consequences, the ripples of betrayal spreading far and wide. Darlene, sensing the strain on her father and brother, decided to move back home for a semester after college. Her presence was a blessing, a steadying force. She helped with Seth, with chores, offering a quiet, unspoken support that Calvin desperately needed. She brought a lightness back into the house, a sense of shared resilience. Calvin found comfort in the mundane, in the predictable rhythms of his new life. He spent hours in the garage working on his old Ford pickup, the smell of oil and grease, a familiar balm. He tended to the small garden in the backyard, watching things grow, feeling the earth in his hands. These simple, tangible acts provided a sense of control, a quiet anchor in the storm. He also started volunteering at the local Veterans Center, sharing stories, listening to others, finding a new sense of purpose in helping those who had walked similar paths. He found camaraderie there, a shared understanding that transcended words. It was different from the military, but it was still service. Occasionally, he'd see Walt Henderson in town, at the hardware store or the grocery. Their interactions were brief, a silent acknowledgement across an aisle, a cold nod. No words were exchanged. There was nothing left to say. The sight of Walt still stirred a flicker of old anger, but it quickly faded, replaced by a quiet determination. Calvin focused on creating a stable, loving environment for his children. The best revenge, he realized, wasn't vengeance, but a well-lived life, full of integrity and quiet strength. He found solace in the quiet rhythms of rural life, the sunrise over the woods each morning, painting the sky with colors only nature could conjure, the sound of crickets at night, a constant lullaby, the steady flow of the river. These were the things that endured, that healed. The Zippo lighter, once a symbol of his marriage, now sat in a drawer in his study, a stark reminder of what was lost, but also of his own resilience. He began to accept that healing was not a single event, but a long, slow process, much like the changing seasons, each bringing its own growth, its own quiet renewal. Years passed, blurring into a new normal. Seth, now a lanky teenager, had grown tall, his voice deeper, but he still carried the quiet scars of his parents' divorce. A subtle reticence, a tendency to hold back, marked him. He was a good kid, respectful, but the early upheaval had left its indelible mark. Darlene, after finishing her degree, had built a successful career in Spokane, a graphic designer with a keen eye and a steady hand. She visited often, her loyalty to Calvin and Seth unwavering. But a lingering resentment towards her mother remained, a wall of hurt that Brenda's sporadic, often half-hearted, attempts to mend fences couldn't penetrate. Trust, once fractured, proved difficult, if not impossible, to fully repair. One evening, Seth sat across from Calvin at the kitchen table, his homework pushed aside. "Dad," he started, his voice a little hesitant, "about Mom and Walt. Why did you stay quiet about it for so long? Before you told us?" Calvin paused, stirring his coffee. The question had always been there, unspoken. "When I first found out," he began, "I tried to deny it, to myself mostly. I wanted my old life back, the one I thought I was coming home to." He looked at Seth, his gaze steady. "And then after I knew, it was about protecting you two. Protecting Darlene, protecting you. I didn't want to blow up the whole world right then, but I couldn't live with the lie either." He explained the commitment he felt to his family, his initial denial, and the eventual excruciating pain of discovery. "It's important, Seth," Calvin continued, his voice low, "to be honest in your relationships, to have integrity. You tell the truth, even when it's hard, because a Liam, no matter how small, can unravel everything." He spoke not with bitterness, but with the quiet authority of hard-won experience. Around that time, Walt Henderson's camp eventually closed down. The property was sold, and Walt himself left the area, a quiet, almost unnoticed disappearance. Calvin heard it through the grapevine, a local shop owner mentioning that Walt had gone south. There was no satisfaction in the news, just a sense of closure, a thread finally cut. He sometimes reflected on the what-ifs. What if he hadn't accepted the ride? What if Brenda had told him earlier? What if he'd stayed in the service? But ultimately, he knew he had made the right choices for his children, the choices that preserved their stability, their home. Years later, Calvin sat in the crowded gymnasium watching Seth walk across the stage to receive his high school diploma. A swell of pride, deep and profound, rose within him. His boy. He scanned the faces in the crowd, and even though he knew it was futile, he saw Seth do the same, his eyes searching, a faint hope in their depths. Brenda was not there. Later, a generic card arrived in the mail congratulating Seth, signed simply, Mom. No personal message, no warmth. Darlene, standing beside Seth, put an arm around his shoulder. We're proud of you, Seth, she said, her voice soft, reinforcing their bond, a family forged in adversity, stronger for having endured. Calvin watched them, his two children, navigating their own lives, their own relationships. He hoped they learned from his past, from the pain and the resilience. He knew the long-term impact of betrayal wasn't just on the immediate parties, but that it rippled through generations, shaping perceptions, coloring futures. He could see it in Seth's guardedness, in Darlene's fierce independence. The memory of Brenda's betrayal still surfaced sometimes, a dull ache in the quiet hours of the night. It was a scar, not an open wound. It no longer paralyzed him, no longer consumed his thoughts. He found strength in his connection to his land, the rhythm of the seasons, the quiet stability of his community. He found dignity in simply enduring, in raising his children, in finding a new purpose. The world had shifted, but he had held firm, a weathered pillar against the relentless Midwestern winds. Calvin was an older man now, his hair a distinguished silver, the lines around his eyes deeper, but his gaze remained steady. Seth was off at college, a quiet, thoughtful young man finding his way. Darlene, thriving in her career, visited often, bringing a familiar warmth to the old house. Life, against all odds, had found its rhythm. Years after the divorce, the phone rang. It was Brenda, her voice hesitant, seeking a meeting. Calvin agreed, not from a place of longing, but for a sense of closure, a quiet understanding of how lives had unraveled. They met at a coffee shop in town, the conversation stilted but honest. Brenda spoke of remorse, acknowledging the pain she caused, the price she'd paid. I messed up, Cal, she whispered, her eyes watery. Calvin listened, offering no forgiveness, but a quiet, almost detached acceptance of what transpired. He spoke of his peace, his children, his contentment in the Idaho woods. He walked away from that meeting, feeling a burden lifted, a final thread cut. His days were spent tending his 5 acres, his hands calloused from honest work, his mind finding peace in the soil. He mentored young veterans at the local center, sharing lessons from the Corps and from the harder school of home. One afternoon, Seth found the old Zippo lighter, long forgotten in a drawer, asking about its inscription. Calvin told him the story, not with bitterness, but with a quiet wisdom about life's complexities, the choices people make, and the paths they forge. He sat on his porch swing, watching the sunset paint the trees in hues of orange and purple, the air crisp and clean. Calvin Miller, the Marine, the father, the man, found a quiet contentment on his Midwestern soil, having paid the price and found his own kind of peace.